Hi friends, how's it going? I hope we're all good. It's been a really long time. I'm finally back in Copenhagen. I took a little August holiday visiting the US. We were staying with my family in Washington State, Sammamish, Washington, which is a little suburb of Seattle where I grew up. It was a lot of fun. We spent a lot of time hiking and swimming and enjoying the beautiful nature of the Pacific Northwest, which I always find so nostalgic and rejuvenating. And we brought Maple, which was so fun. She really loved it there. Where I grew up is a really interesting place because naturally it's this beautiful forest with the most amazing lakes at the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And in the mid-90s, when I was born, it saw a huge amount of growth and it sort of morphed from this quasi-rural town area into a very pleasant, desirable suburb on the outskirts of the Seattle metro area. So the built environment there is really just your classic 90s or 2000s American suburb. And being back in American suburbia had me thinking a lot about city planning and American cities versus suburbs, and especially how different both of those are from European cities. One of the things I most appreciate about living in Denmark is the wonderful design of cities and towns and neighborhoods here, and more specifically the way that most buildings here just fit so nicely and effortlessly into their urban context. And North America in general, but especially American suburbs, are just so different in that department. I find it very fascinating and I have a lot to say about it. So I thought I'd make a little video monologuing about it. Not only about suburban design and development, but also how American suburban culture has shaped the architectural language there. I honestly never really thought super critically about urban planning until I studied architecture and design in university. And then my passion for it was really amplified the first time I moved from the US to Europe when I was 20 years old. And I was able to experience firsthand the major benefits of living in a well-designed urban environment. And most of my viewers, you guys watching this, are in the US and between the ages of 25 and 35. So I suspect that a good amount of you have at some point in your life lived in or experienced an American suburban home. So hopefully this is interesting to you in some way. And to those of you outside the US and or those of you who are unfamiliar with suburbia, maybe this will be an interesting little window into American suburban life. Or maybe not. You'll have to let me know. All right, so let's dip our toes into a little bit of urban design, shall we? Many of you probably know the suburbanization of the United States happened in a major way along with the economic boom that followed World War II in the 1940s and 50s. American identity and pride was arguably stronger than ever. The US had a brand new highway system. Almost everybody could afford their own car, and home mortgages became very easily accessible, which all came together to give birth to the suburban community, which were these communities that were built just outside of city centers. And they were basically offering middle-class Americans like their own little micro estate. With all the convenience of the city and the peace and quiet of the countryside, the suburb allowed you to own your own little detached house, buffered from your neighbors by a green lawn with a nice little tidy fence along the property line. This is when the concept of the American dream became very neatly tied to the idea of owning your own single-family home and ultimately the privacy and prestige that afforded, which makes a lot of sense in the US, which is a nation founded on these values of individualism. So having your private detached house to live in on your private square of land that just belongs to you is like the ultimate goal, right? And then these neighborhoods are built by developers all at once with the privacy of these houses as a driving value. So the planning of the entire neighborhood is obviously heavily dictated by that. In the name of protecting property values, suburban zoning codes enforce this super rigid use of space. In most suburban communities, it's actually not legal to open, for example, a neighborhood coffee shop on a residential street. Instead, these communities consolidate all of their commercial spaces into these sort of strip mall shopping centers, which are usually arranged around a big parking lot. So you have your little boxes for living and your big box for shopping. And you almost always need to drive to these shopping centers, regardless of how close you live. They're not really designed to be approached by foot or by bike. And because of this super rigid distinction between homes and shops, there aren't really any streets in suburbia. And what I mean by that is a street with any sort of degree of life to it, which is really interesting if you think about it hard enough, because for millennia, humans have been living in cities and towns, even villages that are these really interesting, dynamic ecosystems of housing and shops, like residential and commercial spaces. So for the suburb to come along and separate those in such a deliberate and extreme way, it's frankly really unique and, in my opinion, pretty unnatural. As a side note, a professor at my university, Howard Davis, wrote a very interesting book on this called Living Over the Store, which I can really warmly recommend to any of you that are interested in this topic. We had an entire design studio about this, so I think it really impacted the way I see cities. I will say I've noticed in the past 10 years or so that some newer developments in the US are making an effort to create these sort of pleasant, walkable suburban town centers, sometimes even with a healthy mix of housing and retail space, which is really great. I think creating housing in the US that offers a lifestyle that's not 100% car dependent is definitely really nice to see. But I have to say, it's not just the separation of residential and commercial spaces that sucks so much life out of the American suburbs. Also, the design of a typical suburban house in the US just leaves so much to be desired. First of all, let me just say, in my opinion, building an entire neighborhood all at once as a project has such a negative impact on a built environment. It's just inevitably artificial. When every building in a community was designed and built at the same time by the same team of architects and developers, by definition, it will be entirely homogeneous. There's no dialogue between buildings or any individuality in design, which personally I find pretty unpleasant. And the fact that these communities are being driven by values of individualism and capitalism is undeniably pretty fascinating and ironic, right? And oftentimes homeowners associations will take this to an even more extreme level, dictating things that you can do to your house, like what color can you paint your home, or how tall can your plants be? Just nonsense things like that, all in the name of property values, which personally I think sucks. But okay, those are sort of critiques of suburbs as a concept, right? The sort of homogeneous design and zoning codes that define a suburb. But say we're going with this suburban model. Say we're a development team designing a community where an average American family can own a single family detached home on an entirely residential street that they primarily access by car. The shape that the typical American suburban home has taken is so wildly out of step with what that concept could be It's honestly pretty crazy. It comes down to how these houses relate to the street and also their neighboring houses, rather than leaning into the privacy and comfort that a single family home offers. Instead, most suburban homes today put an insane amount of design energy into their facades and their facades alone. Like for the developers, it's all about curb appeal. It's all about how this house looks from the street, from the outside. The facades almost always have this kind of ridiculously overemphasized front door, which we all know is solely used for greeting guests because usually the people that live in these houses enter their house through the garage. And the front of the house will have like interesting roof lines and some push and pull of architectural masses and material combinations, beautiful windows. You get what I mean, right? Like there's a lot of energy going into the facade of the house, while the other three sides are just like flat boxes with a few windows randomly punched into them. In general, you guys know that I value authenticity above all else in design, so this sort of fake McMansion-y approach is deeply upsetting to me, unsurprisingly. I am planning a video specifically on McMansions sometime soon, so stay tuned for that. But back to our typical suburban home, not quite a McMansion, just a cookie cutter suburban house. I want to point out that it's not just the facade that has this sort of performative, presentational attitude to it. The interior planning is also super guilty of this. I feel like almost every suburban house built after, say, the early 80s has a really similar layout, and a feature of that layout is this sort of transitional formal room that's the first room you see when you walk in. It's set up for families to have this like pristine, untouched living room really close to the front door. I feel like most suburban families use this room once a year on Christmas morning, and it'll be paired with a formal dining space as well, which you can usually see from the front door. And there's almost always this central staircase that's just opposite the front entrance. And then behind that staircase is the actual house where people live. That's where the kitchen is, the family room with the TV, the informal dining space, basically where people actually are in their day-to-day lives. It will almost always be tucked in the back of the house and connected to the backyard. It's actually crazy if you give it a little bit of thought. Like a huge amount of space inside these houses is being allocated to formal rooms that are primarily observed, not actually used or lived in. And it's not a coincidence that they're always at the front of the house. It's like a presentational room. It's there to be seen by the guest, not to be used by the homeowner. Personally, the house I grew up in was built in the mid-70s, I believe, although it had gone through a few renovations. So it was built when the area was actually a bit more rural. It wasn't part of one of these suburban developments. So I didn't technically grow up in this kind of house, although almost everyone in my community lived in this kind of house. It was 100% the norm. And I never felt like anyone really thought about how odd it is. I honestly never really considered it until I studied design. And then I realized how like disturbing and strange it is. And going back to the discomfort of walking past these houses with overly designed facades that feel like masks, I think it adds a layer of discomfort knowing that the big windows at the front of these houses almost always lead to an empty, formal space. Like you can be almost 100% certain that there are no people in any of these windows because the families in houses like these exist at the back of the house. It's just a really strange thing, but I think you probably get my point by now. It's pretty clear that the values behind the design of a home like this are not the privacy, quiet, or comfort that a suburb offers, but rather it's the image and societal prestige that comes with owning a single family home in the United States. The design of these homes is performative. It's artificial. It's clearly prioritizing external perception rather than internal experience. It's about the people out there and what they think, and not the people in here and how they feel. Does that make sense? And the crazy thing is that suburban home design wasn't always so out of step with the benefits of a suburb. If we do just like a quick look at the evolution of a suburban house in the US, initially the first suburban homes, like those in Levittown, were these very modest little boxes. They were a really simple and pretty reasonable answer to the post-war housing boom. With the exception of being detached single-family homes, these houses were really far from portraying any sort of luxury or opulence to people outside. And into the 50s and 60s, the architecture and interior design that we see honestly feels like a really great response to this sort of suburban planning. Designs remained relatively modest, and we start to see the incorporation of garages and carports. And with that brings this sort of natural distinction between the public front of house and more private back of house. And a lot of mid-century architects and designers in the US really sort of roll with this idea. They start to create these houses that are really closed off to the street in a pretty humble way. Rather than having this sort of performative facade, they would actually avoid having any visual connection to the street, often by incorporating like some sort of privacy partition, like a breeze block wall, for example. And in the mid-20th century, this developer in California named Joseph Eichler, he took this idea to the extreme, and he actually started building homes that were oriented around a central courtyard. This obviously worked to bring daylight into the center of the house, but it also introduced some really nice visual connections between interior spaces. And to me, it's like, okay, if we're going to build detached single-family homes in a suburban environment, like, let's at least be real about the fact that we're trying to isolate our homes from one another. Like, this is the way to do it. This is being honest about the benefits and concept of suburban life, right? It's not pretending to be something it's not. And Eichler homes just have such thoughtfully designed interiors. Like, it's such a better answer to daylight and privacy and what a suburban home could be. But rather than continuing on this path, in the decades that followed, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the suburban home slowly morphed into this, my nightmare. And I'm still not totally clear on why this design approach came out on top. I think the consumerism and opulence and sort of mall culture of the 80s had a really big effect on suburban America, which is a bummer, but I guess true. But yeah, I think I'm gonna wrap up the video here. If you have lived in an American suburban home like this, I would love to know if these thoughts resonate with you. Maybe you even also had a formal living room that you only used on Christmas morning. Let me know down in the comments. Also, I know that I've been posting very sporadically this summer. I just wanna say that it's September, I'm back, we're back to school, and I'm planning to post much more regularly. So my apologies for being kind of MIA. I've been like half on holiday for a couple months now, but I'm here, we're back, school is back in session, and I'll be posting more regularly from now on. And my next video is going to be a subscriber advice video. And I still haven't chosen which of your spaces I'll be featuring, so it's not too late to submit photos of your home to noahdanielstudio at gmail.com. And yeah, I'll see you in a couple weeks. Say goodbye to our friends. Bye, friends. And we have a special guest this week. Gigi is staying with us. Gigi. Say goodbye to Gigi. Bye. Okay. Bye.